Recognize. Umbral Walker. D01. Recognize. The Caleb G. D02.
Hello, team. Thank you for listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files, episode 16. Welcome to the cave. I am everyone's favorite sidekick, Caleb, and I've been remarkably patient, for me. And please allow me to introduce Rich. Lower beings tend to fear intimacy. Howard.
So spot on both of those things. So spot on.
As always, thank you so much for listening. We appreciate you joining us for this hour of audio as we talk about the show we love so much. If you would like to get a hold of us, please contact us on Twitter at the YJ Files. The show email is whelmedpodcast@gmail.com. And of course, our show website is www.crashingthemode.com.
Here's the ugly truth. I wasn't devastated. Even with Superman, Tornado, you, the whole league dead. Even though I didn't save Wolf, I watched Artemis and Kaldor die and abandon McGann. I felt at peace. See, from the moment I first opened my eyes in that Cadmus pod, there's been one thing I've wanted and feared. To know what it is to be Superman. And I knew. So I was happy. Everyone I care about dead or traumatized, and I'm happy. How do I get past the guilt of that? How do I live with myself?
And with that housekeeping out of the way, permit me to turn the reins over to Rich for...
Hello, Megan!
All right, the title of our episode this week is Disordered. The release date was November 11th, 2011. Previous episode was a week before on the 4th. The in-episode date is October 23rd, about a week later from the previous episode. The director was Michael Chang, and the writer was Andrew Robinson.
And we don't really have any special guest voice actors here in Disordered, so let's kick it right over to our mission briefing.
Just in time for your next mission.
All right, in our pre-credit scene, we open up with shots of the team. Joyously celebrate. No, wait a minute. A week
wrong
later,
episode.
Wrong episode. Still shaken by the events of Failsafe a week before. Batman asks Red Tornado how the team is doing and that he thought they would have rallied by now, leading to Red Tornado to say, "Trauma tends to linger, as I know you know, my friend." Which was kettle pot. Here we learn that Black Canary has taken on the task of counseling the team, and we get a glimpse into her session with Superboy, who is stoic and resisting the conversation, and Black Canary calls him out for being the Superboy we all have come to expect, or at least we think, anyway.
From there, we cut over to a Metropolis park, where a boom tube opens, dumping out a flying car carrying 5 teenagers with attitude. No, it's just 5 teenagers in goofy color-coded clothing. So the same thing. Their leader uses something he refers to as a mother box to translate their language into English, then scans the planet for whatever they're looking for, which turns out to be Sphere, or as he calls it, the new Genosphere.
And then we cut back to the cave. Superboy jumps on his motorcycle. He had already left the meeting with Canary, telling her, "You don't know me," basically. Jumps on his motorcycle to head out of the cave when Sphere stops him, but then transforms itself into a huge motorcycle-like vehicle. Superboy and Wolf climb aboard, and the three fly off. Batman tries to call Superboy back, but Superboy once again has tossed his comm. The alien teenagers eventually run into Superboy and Sphere because they're tracking Sphere, and nearly start a fight in classic comic fashion until Sphere apparently tells the mother box that Superboy saved it from the real thieves. Then we find out that the group that came out of the boom tube called themselves the Forever People, that they are new gods, quote-unquote, from a planet called New Genesis. And then the newly allied group then heads out together to track down the other stolen gear from New Genesis.
Back in the cave, Canary meets with Artemis, who reminds Canary that she was unconscious, so she never, quote, forgot that it was an exercise. The two discuss Artemis's reluctance to tell the team about her real background, and Canary makes it clear to the audience that Artemis is definitely not the niece of Green Arrow. Then Artemis makes a comment about how Wally would react to knowing the truth.
And Canary calls her out. Meanwhile, Superboy and the Forever People track a rescue drill to a construction site across from the Federal Reserve Bank. They discover that Ugly Mannheim and Intergang has acquired a range of weapons from New Genesis's enemy, the planet Apocalypse. The Forever People managed to defeat most of Intergang by forming the Infinity Man, a huge, very 70s, 80s construct that combines the 5 teenagers into a giant energy robot thingy.
So my joke about Power Rangers is not that far off, guys. We go back to the cave. Wally is now speaking with Canary, and this is very predictable Wally. He is in denial of everything that is not life is awesome. And Canary reminds him that he was more upset at Artemis's death than any of the other members, and points out that he is in denial. Wally says he's fine with that.
Followed by Robin's session. Robin admits, of course, that after having led his teammates to their deaths, he has come to understand that he does not have the same, quote, thing inside him, unquote, that drives Batman to sacrifice anything and everything for his mission. He still wants to be a hero, but for the first time in his life, he knows that he no longer wants to be the Batman anymore.
Cutting back to the action, the Mother Box tracks more apocalyptic tech to a warehouse, and while the group fights Intergang again, Desaad arrives. This is Apocalypse's lead scientist and head torturer. When the Forever People combined into Infinity Man, Desaad throws a father box into the energy field, corrupting the construct and forcing Superboy to fight it. Sphere turns into what we learn is called Pillbug mode and takes control of Infinity Man for Superboy.
Back with Canary, McGann's session has her taking responsibility for the nightmare. She wants to not use her powers anymore. And Canary shares a story about how she nearly deafened her first grade class the first time she discovered her canary cry and tried just not to talk, but realized that controlling it was the much better option. Back in the fight, Desaad finally admits defeat, throwing an explosive before escaping into a boom tube. The explosion damages Sphere badly, taking him out of Pillbug mode, which releases Infinity Man, returns the Forever People to their normal forms. After the group argues about Sphere returning to New Genesis, whether Sphere will return or not, the Forever People agree that the friendship between Superboy and Sphere is important and that she should stay with him.
Our final scene of the episode is Superboy returning to the cave, sitting with Canary. In the earlier scene, Canary made the assumption that Superboy was being too tough to talk about his feelings, and instead he reveals the ugly truth that he was not devastated by the loss experienced in the last episode. He instead was at peace. He's always wanted and needed to know what it feels like to be Superman, to fill the shoes he was literally created to fill, and he was happy. And we end with a conversation about how can he deal with the guilt of being happy at the expense of everyone's death. And on that wonderful note, we are going to move on.
Superboy, are you alright?
I'm fine. Feeling the Aster.
Boy, feeling the Aster on that line.
Wow, what a transition, guys.
Oh my gosh.
So we are coming back from the gut punch of the last episode to another crazy episode. This time, again, dealing with all those consequences we were talking about last week.
Yeah.
And in this almost bizarre contradiction of events in this episode, we've got this really, really heavy personal realization and therapy clashing with crazy, over-the-top, super colorized, super stylized punching.
Yeah, exactly. For a reason. And we'll get
it's
to that.
A specific reason, and it's awesome, and it's a great, great episode. it absolutely is the right way to follow up something as heavy and traumatic as Failsafe.
Yeah, absolutely. One of our listeners and friend of the podcast was watching the show thanks to hearing us talking about it. He got to this episode and he's like, what is happening? This is really weird. Definitely I can see some stuff about the fourth world, which is what the Forever People and New Genesis Apocalypse kind of all encompass, that was created by Jack Kirby back in the day. It's a very 60s, 70s-esque designs, influenced the characters' like language and how they're named and that kind of thing, very influenced by that era. The way that the vehicles, which I love, are always at this like steep dramatic angle whenever they stop in midair. Very Jack Kirby. And we talk with Jeff Stormer from the Party of One podcast in depth about his love of the fourth world and the history that I wasn't even aware of behind where the fourth world came from when Jack Kirby moved from Marvel back to DC and introduced this thing he wanted to do. It's pretty cool stuff. But the idea that the fourth world in this particular space is this breakup, you get some action, you get, like Caleb said, this over-the-top kind of color, a little bit silly or odd or oddball view into that part of the DC universe, counterpointing the seriousness and giving us a chance to breathe while we're dealing with these terrible, terrible fallout of Failsafe.
And I think what is most interesting here is the fallout is completely emotional and internal.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is no physical repercussion. We talked frequently last episode about consequence, and the consequence is all emotional trauma. And it's really interesting to me anyway that in a superhero cartoon, you mostly expect to deal with people getting hurt, buildings getting blown up, big, dramatic, dynamic things happening. And the consequence that you deal with is all physical, is all real, tangible, tactical things. The heaviest, worst, most intense part of this episode is two people in a chair across from each other with a freaking houseplant in a library. Right? This is therapy. This is superhero therapy.
It's literally therapy. We're watching a therapy session, and we want to watch all of it. We want every drop that they will give us.
Shout out to Darcy Ross. Again, it's all your fault for this, Darcy. Right. The first time she watched this episode, and she was live tweeting all of it, she said, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember, oh my goodness, superhero therapy is the most amazing thing ever.
Right.
Why isn't there a game about this?
Right. I think she said something like, the game I want to play is superhero teens sitting in a room talking about the fallout of a mission.
Right.
It's so good.
And it's surprising that it is so good.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Not surprising that Young Justice can do it well, because we know that Young Justice has the quality to do it.
Yeah.
It's surprising that it works. It's surprising that in a cartoon that is action driven, it works to stop the momentum of the action and just sit in a chair and talk about your feelings.
Right. And if it had been a whole episode of that after Failsafe, it would have been too much. And if it's none of that, if we'd had an entire like, oh, well, we had a heavy episode last episode, let's do a light episode now, and everything was kind of silly and light, then we'd be like, wait,
where's the consequence?
Where's the consequence of this thing that was just terrifying? They made it a nice balance. They gave us a chance to breathe and kind of get back into the action and get our feet back under us with the Superboy and fighting Intergang and a real straightforward problem, while still introducing elements that need to be introduced for the rest of the series, and then also cutting back to these life-changing moments with the team. Just amazing.
Let me throw out a couple of just fun things that I liked about this episode.
Yeah.
I love that Canary is introduced as being much more than a fighter.
Yeah.
That she is really good at this.
Yep.
She's not just, hey, I'm someone you can talk to. She is a flat-out therapist, analyst in these scenes.
Yeah.
And she's really competent at it.
Yeah.
One of my favorite moments of this episode is when the team is sitting in the living room and the TV is in the background and it just says no signal.
Right.
I think that's hilarious. I don't know why I think it's hilarious. It's a little bit of a throwback to the episode when
Superboy was sitting in front of the TV.
Yep, with cookie dough all over his face. So I think that's hilarious. The Forever People are just so goofy and so silly.
Yep.
And it is absolutely the right break we need in this episode to keep everything moving.
Yeah.
And Intergang.
Yeah.
Intergang is a fun little part of Metropolis. Intergang was a big part of the Superman animated series. Mm-hmm. Intergang was a part, going back to my childhood, of Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, which I watched the bejesus out of when I was that age.
Right.
So it's just cool to see that. It's really cool to see all of that.
It's a reflection of like the comic book powers or other things. It's like, how do things adapt? How do normal people adapt, right? How does a police department adapt to being in a world full of super crimes? How does a mob or mafia organization adapt itself to a world full of superpowers and alien freaky Kirby tech? You know what I mean? Like, Intergang is your answer. Intergang is your literary answer to that. And I'm glad that they bring him in.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we will see Intergang again.
We do. We see Ugly Mannheim as well. And, oh God, what's her name? Adair. I can't remember her first name. They're in the second season too. We see them in the second season as well.
Right.
But we also introduced some other stuff that comes up. Like, again, we're talking about the Kirby tech, but the idea of the mother boxes, the father boxes, they make returns later on. The father box in season 2 is kind of like, where Nightwing is like, whoa, wait, what is that? Like, where'd you get that? That kind of thing. Again, planting these seeds all through both seasons for our end of season 2 reveal. Just amazing stuff.
All right. Enough dilly-dallying here. We need to talk about these heavy therapy moments.
Yeah. This Robin moment is so good. I talked a little bit about it in our Robin-specific episode, but how this parallels the conversation about letting your character take the lead in their own development. This Batman is a little different than other Batman incarnations. You can see it in his concern for the kids at the beginning of this episode. We see it later on in the season as well, and what he says and does and how he incorporates things. We saw it in Downtime when he was playing ball with Robin, that kind of thing. So we know that this Batman is really sticking to the original heart of what the Robin-Batman dynamic was, is that he knew that Dick Grayson needed to catch the Tony Zuko and the people who murdered his parents so that he wouldn't carry that guilt around with him all the time like Batman does. And this show really starts to see how Robin is different. He's not carrying that thing, quote-unquote thing, inside him that Batman does. And this, we get to see Dick Grayson really come into his own. Like, he's been great this whole season. And here it's like him growing up again, and it's very reflective of the emotional memory I have of Judas Contract and that era in comics when Dick Grayson had left the mantle of Robin but hadn't quite figured out what he was going to do next. I just loved it. No surprise.
Let's swing over to Aqualad. Let's jump over to Calder.
Yeah. No one gets ignored in these therapy sessions.
Yeah, everyone gets their own scene. Everyone gets a chance to deal with the trauma, and we get to see the impact on all of them. Calder is ready to walk away.
Yeah.
He says, I need to resign. I let this happen, basically.
What he says was, which I found really interesting, was, again, reflective of the fact that Aquaman is his mentor, not Batman. This idea that he said, I acted like a soldier, not like a general, right? That tells me he's seen leadership in action on the field. The king does not sacrifice himself. The general is not on the front lines for a reason. There's positive and negatives to these things, but he shouldn't have sacrificed himself if he's the leader, because then they have nothing. And he gets that and knows that and wants to put it in his resignation. But the only logical choice is Robin, and he doesn't want to put that mantle on him because we just saw what happened when his mantle got put on him permanently. It was terrifying.
But that also shows us that great friendship between Calder and Dick.
And respect. Like, he doesn't say it like he's so young. He doesn't say it like condescending. He says it in this caring, compassionate, he is the right choice, and you're absolutely right, Canary, but I can't do that to him yet. Like, he's not ready yet, still. Mm-hmm. And no one else is even close.
Right. He is not criticizing Dick for not being ready. He's just saying, I care about Dick as a person. He can't shoulder this yet. I've got to step back into it. Okay. All right. I'm still the leader. Great.
Yeah.
he to me kind of seems like the most emotionally equipped to handle this.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think that's because of in his story, he is coming from working with Arthur being a king and having the weight of a country on his shoulders, not being a soldier trained to complete the mission or a goofy scientist who can run really fast.
Right. Yeah.
So he's got that background, and he's obviously very upset by what happened, but he is able to not internalize it. He is still objectively looking at the situation.
Yep. He's able to look at that big picture, which is what makes him such a great leader. I agree.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's touch on Artemis and Wally here.
They could have passed Artemis, really, because, like she said, I was dead.
Yeah.
I don't remember it.
What we have to understand here, she did not experience McGann's traumatic nightmare scene.
Right, exactly.
When she got killed in Failsafe, she got booted out. She just couldn't wake up.
Right.
But she did not go through the experiences that everyone else in the team did. So yeah, they literally could have just skipped over her because she really didn't experience anything.
Yeah, but they turned it to dive deeper into her character and saying, why haven't you told your friends? We're not telling them. We're leaving it up to you. But do you trust them? Do you care about them? Do you think that they trust you and care about you? Why are you not telling them that you're not who you said you were?
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to do it. You need to take responsibility for this. And then, of course, echoing it with, can you imagine what Wally would do with that? Interesting. Why Wally?
Right. The perfect therapist statement.
Right.
Well, why do you bring up this one particular thing? What does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. And then the reflection of that with Wally as well. The Wally about being in denial. And because through that whole episode, Wally is, we'll find her. And, the rest of them.
Yep.
Everybody else as well. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Good
backpedaling, Wally.
Wally's motivator was Artemis, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Miss M, that was an interesting scene.
Yeah. Being willing to walk away from everything because of what she did to her family.
Yeah. The shape-shifting subconsciously into the white Caucasian and having Canary make that little comment about like, oh, you've turned white, and her freaking out. We still don't know what's going on with that situation. Like there's something that she's hiding as well, but if you're not in our crashing the modes, you're not sure what that is yet. And we'll chat about that a little bit later. Which also gives us a nice look into Canary too. This whole thing of like, yeah, I tried not to talk, which is a normal human thing to breathe and talk. It's pretty common, and I just didn't want to do it because I thought I was going to hurt people, and you can't do that. And I think that was key.
Yeah, it was a cool moment for Canary as well. We've seen her be a fighter. We know she is a trainer. We know she is competent enough to stand with the rest of the league.
Yeah.
In this episode, we are seeing her also exercise this fantastic skill of communication and therapy and discussion.
Yep.
And then we just throw this little fact on top of it, icing on the cake, that when she first demonstrated her superpowers, not just her fighting powers, she internalized everything. She just said, something crazy happened, I'm going to walk away.
Yep.
Because she didn't understand it.
Yeah. It was interesting in this watch through with me too. I was watching because she commonly has this choker, and it kind of made me wonder if there was a reason for that. Like maybe they are kind of echoey the idea of the TV show where they had that high-tech sonic scream thing that they used. I was just wondering if maybe that choker, they're going to do something with that. Or anyway, there's a bit of an aside, but I just noticed it this episode.
It struck me in this version of Canary that is simply a costume aesthetic.
Yeah, and in the comics, she just has that power.
Yeah.
Like, there have been a couple different versions of Black Canary throughout the ages. One of them was just a fighter with no superpowers, and then there was the kind of the modern day interpretation of Canary, which is having this canary cry thing, which is the canary that I grew up with in the 70s and 80s. Mm-hmm. We were talking, and you were making an interesting observation about Connor, though, not in the therapy sessions, about how he's the only team member that interacts with the Forever People, and we get to see him, since he's not around Calder and he's not around Robin, he's the expert on Earth, right? We get to see him shine a little bit.
Yeah, Connor gets to be a hero in this episode. And
Absolutely.
He's a hero for real, not just a hero in a pretend psychic training exercise.
Yes, good point. And the leadership, he's telling him, like, you guys need a plan. To hear Superboy say, what's the plan? It's really interesting.
Yeah, Superboy, what's the plan? Oh, they're just storming ahead without a plan. I guess they're just going to go punch the guy. Shucks. That's what you did like 4 episodes ago, man. Come on.
Right. And I love the quote you pulled. They're like, I've been remarkably patient, for me.
This episode was just one great Connor line after another.
It's totally true.
So many great lines from him about being cool. This was a great Connor episode. I love this episode just for Connor.
Yeah.
It was so great to see him, who is normally the outsider compared to everyone else, become the one who knows things.
Yeah.
And watch him deal with people who are, in their turn, outsiders to what he knows.
Right. And we see this, it's kind of lays that groundwork for who we see him becoming in season 2.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the therapy. Mm-hmm. So Canary's trying to talk to him. He doesn't want to talk. He storms off. We expect that from him.
Right.
We see him as being the only member of the team dealing with this action break. I see that as kind of physical therapy. He needs to work out his understanding. He needs to get the blood flowing. He didn't want to come to terms with his reasoning why the events of Failsafe did not faze him.
Yeah.
In order to do that, he needed to step into that leadership role for a moment.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like that idea of like him working out this thing physically. And letting his brain rest and then being able to look at it from a different perspective. So deeply.
Yeah. When he goes back to the cave, we don't see him walking in. We don't see him apologizing or Canary forcing him to sit down. We just cut back to him sitting and holding his head in his hands. So I want to believe that he willingly walked in.
And I think that's what that kind of scene transition does. Right?
Mm-hmm.
How he got there doesn't matter, but we already know that he left and Canary wasn't going to force him to stay there from the beginning, because I think he sits down and the first person who talks isn't Canary. He's there, he's sitting, and he's like, here's the ugly truth. Right? So he's clearly volunteering. So you can see that, again, that character growth and that idea of having a main character like Canary not force him to grow and to change as a character.
And what he admits is so heavy, so hugely important to his character.
I get excited about stuff and I like the way they handle stuff. This show catches me off guard in the best possible ways. I got spanked. I got spanked because I had the same preconception of Connor as Black Canary did at the beginning of this episode. I know you're tough, you don't want to talk about your emotions. But you know what? He's never said that or really acted like that in this whole show. I made a cliched stereotype of him. I made an assumption that Black Canary reflected in the audience. He's much deeper than we think he is. And I love that this episode took me off guard in a couple of ways. And it makes me cry every time. We were talking about this. I was watching this episode, doing this outline. I was sitting in a Starbucks, and I was just like, why am I doing this to myself? Because I'm sitting there, and I got a tear going down my cheek, and people are looking at me, and I'm like, I don't know, man, Superboy. I don't know what to tell you. It's terrible.
But it's fantastic to learn more about the character. This show has given us a lot of insight into all of these team members.
Yeah.
And this is one of the first times we really got a solid understanding of Connor.
Yeah.
We learned a lot about him in the fact that he knows a lot. He has a lot of knowledge. We know that he's going through this struggle of, am I Superman? Am I a weapon? What's my place in the world?
Yeah.
And in this last 30 seconds of this episode, we see so much about him. We learn so much about him. And he's saying, how do I deal with myself?
Right. And I love the fact that Canary doesn't have a pat answer. She's caught off guard just like we are. She's like, oh, crap, I have nothing. I got nothing for you, man. That sucks. The only thing I know is that you got to talk about it. And then the answer is going to come to you for you.
And all of that is very real, very humanizing.
Yeah.
we are seeing in this scene that these big costumed characters have another level underneath.
A level we can relate to very easily and
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah, all of us have experienced loss and guilt and anger and denial and self-blaming for problems. Every single thing that the team members go through, we felt in one way or another at one time or another.
Yeah.
So this episode is not only delivering that conclusion of the consequences from the last episode, it's not only delivering the plot points that move the meta plot forward, but it's reminding us that we like these characters for a reason, because even in this make-believe pretend world, they are going through the exact same things that we can identify with. I don't know what it's like to deal with a supervillain and punch someone in the face, but I know what it's like to hate myself because of a decision I made.
Yeah. Yeah. No kidding. Or hate yourself for how you feel about something in a way that you can't control.
Yep.
That's the thing about the Superboy thing.
Yeah.
Right? I felt this way. It's okay, McGann. It's what Superman would do. Jeez. You know,
Yeah.
like, and then the fact that not only you know now in that scene that he's doing this because he finally feels like he belongs somewhere. And how do you deal with the fact that the comfort and the peace that you feel at finally belonging had to come at the consequence of everyone who has cared about you dying? You have no control over the situation that leads to those feelings. How can you process the guilt of them if you had no control over them coming in the first place?
But with all of that in mind, when we see his character develop through even just the rest of season 1, let alone season 2, it makes it that much better.
Yeah, and he becomes more him.
Yeah.
And stops being I don't have two choices. I don't have weapon or Superman.
This is kind of his breaking point. This is where...
Yeah, good point, yeah.
From this point forward, we see some really cool things happen with his character, and I think this is where he understood himself.
Yeah.
He said, okay, I experienced this. I've got to deal with it. It's not just black and white. I'm not trying to decide between what I am and what I was told. I can be my own person. And at this point, we see him turn and start to really explore and develop.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's move on to Canary Debrief. We've been talking about Canary for a while. Let's break this down and talk about the story.
Let's do it.
Stick around. Class is in session.
All right, the two things I want to bring up are consequences and balancing emotional beats. The consequences may sound obvious at first, but you need to allow your main character's moments to process and integrate something that has just happened to them. It could be a small event that happened in your, say, novel, or it could be a large event. Allowing them to process that in turn allows your audience to do the same thing. When you have intense scenes or you have an intense episode like Failsafe, this gives everyone a breather and allows your audience to catch up and to process potential consequences. This is often kind of reflected in that success-failure cycle of storytelling. So heroes take an action, they succeed in some part of that action, but then fail in some major way. And this keeps going until you have a success at the end. In the main plot of this episode, you see that success-failure in like Superboy and the Forever People succeeding against that first batch of Intergang through the use of the Infinity Man, but then failing badly, facing the second group. And then using that failure to reveal new information, like Sphere's Pillbug form, or the fact that the Infinity Man is not an infallible thing, or more information about Desaad and the Apocalyptan technology, right? So that success-failure cycle is great, but those failures and those reflections on that failure allows the characters and your audience to recover and think about what maybe to do next. And this plays into the balancing emotional beats as well. We talked about the fact that this episode introduces some of the what can be considered some of the sillier aspects of DC Comics, but the actual story of New Genesis and Apocalypse is pretty epic, to be perfectly honest. But it's that Jack Kirby 60s, 70s art that makes it feel a little silly, and the idea of like Dreamer being the name of one of the characters is very 60s kind of character reflection in the dynamic angles and all that. But here, in that subplot, The subplot of the deep emotional fallout from the previous episode is broken up by the use of introducing something that needed to be introduced. If you just had a Fourth World Jack Kirby full-on episode, it might have felt weirdly out of place. Here, Superboy's calling it being out of place. Like, you guys are freaking me out. And I've been really patient, but it's time for you to stop and tell me what's happening, which allows us to get information, and Superboy becomes our entry point character into the New Genesis Apocalypse storyline. In addition to that, the action moves the larger meta plot forward, while we're allowed to also take a breath and reflect with the main characters. It doesn't stagnate anything, right? We get to learn about boom tubes, and we get to learn about mother and father boxes that play so heavily into season 2. We see lots of character growth across the board for everyone, but we get a breather from the action with the psychological reflection, and we get a breather from the psychological reflection with the action. This is why this episode is actually, from a construction structure standpoint for writing, is actually really one of the best episodes. It is perfectly what they needed to do at the time they needed to do it.
Alrighty, so with that debrief being done, it is time to move on to crashing the mode.
Tell us something we don't know yet.
Sorry, BB. We can't risk altering the time stream. We do that, we're all feeling the mode.
Let's do it.
We are going to be talking about spoilers here, folks, for Young Justice, the entire series, as well as DC Universe in general. If you do not want to experience these spoilers, please stop listening and return a little bit later. If you are still here, things are going to get spoiled.
Yeah. Well, the Fourth World, all of the apocalypse stuff really comes to a head. We've gotten these hints with the boom tubes and sphere and that kind of stuff, but this is the first very clear connection to Darkseid, with Desaad physically showing up in this episode with that hilariously silly 70s human robot suit he was wearing, which cracks me up. But clearly, this isn't just an apocalypse thing. Clearly, they are definitely bringing in Desaad, which is not a huge surprise, but still. I mean Darkseid. I said Desaad. Darkseid. You know what I meant.
This is also a nice payoff from the Biallion episode.
Yeah,
where
exactly.
we picked up Sphere, getting that payoff. I think it's really important that we're seeing all these threads getting wrapped up and paid off here about halfway through season 1, because that's kind of setting us up to know that a whole lot more is going to be happening in the last half of this season. And it absolutely does.
And what doesn't get paid off now is set up for payoff in season 2.
We talked a lot about Connor and Superboy. This is that turning point where he is growing up, where he is learning to be who he really is and be a hero. I think this sets the stage for what's going to happen in the last part of this season. He ends up getting some knowledge about who he is as a clone. And if we had had the Superboy that was just that, am I a weapon or am I Superman?
Yeah.
Those events would have played out very differently.
They could very well have. I agree with you. I don't want that alternate universe.
No, not at all. And it makes it better because in this episode and going forward, we see that he is a person. We're knowing more about him as a character. So when we see this new struggle that he is going to face, that kind of puts him on par with the other team members and the other heroes that we're looking at. He's evolved past, I'm a clone, oh well, to I'm a person, now I got to deal with personal problems.
Right, absolutely. And you know what's interesting? I really like, this episode, when I was watching it this time, it's so reflective of that second season episode where Superboy and Blue Beetle are flying in the cycle and Ugly Mannheim again. He's got another piece of technology, and they go toe-to-toe, and what's Black Beetle say? He says, like, man, I've never heard of an apple laxative until just now, or something like that. And Superboy's like, freshmen, they never do the homework. And you're seeing that what we see a little bit of here, we see that like more just developed. It was such a nice foundation leading into that leadership senior role that is so different than the Connor we saw in the first few episodes of the show. And I just love that character growth. Same with McGann too. McGann's white, turning white, and knowing that she's a white Martian and the whole deal, now that scene seems much... Oof.
Yeah, that scene is, I think, one of the best payoffs after you learn who she really is.
Yeah.
Going back to that moment of, McGann, you turned white. What?
Yeah.
Because it's puzzling. Why does she react so much that she just shifted back to her disguise? Who cares?
Right. And I think people who know Miss Martian from the more recent years of comics are not surprised by any of this, because as I understand it, this is basically her background in the comics as well. I had none of that. So for me, it's really nice to have this fresh view of an interesting character and be able to tell the creators, no, you nailed it. You pulled it. You pulled it off.
Yeah,
I didn't know what was
absolutely.
happening when I was watching this, and you did it brilliantly.
Obviously, we have talked a lot about what Robin is going through in this episode. This is the birth of Nightwing.
It is. And again, that idea that later on in the season where Batman admits, I did this so Robin wouldn't be me. But we don't get that until later, where we've already seen Robin making that decision, a painful decision for him, because he assumes that Batman wants him to take the mantle. He assumed he would take the mantle. But this whole time, Batman is trying to get it so that he doesn't and becomes his own person and doesn't become him. It's so good.
It points to the success that Batman has with Robin in this story.
Right. Yeah. And with hopefully all the rest of his basically extended family.
I think other versions of Batman would not have been happy with this eventual success.
Yep.
Go back to the animated series when Robin quits being Robin.
Yeah.
They have a fist fight.
Yeah, he literally punches Bruce in the face. Yeah.
And walks away.
Right.
So establishing this version of Batman where he clearly cares about Dick Grayson.
Yeah. And vice versa.
Yeah, they have a good relationship. It's not a...
Let
me rephrase that.
It's not. It's a functional, dysfunctional.
It is more functional on a human level than other versions of Batman and Robin that we have seen.
Right.
And that is very important for this story because the story in Young Justice is truly about family.
Right, absolutely. And I agree with you. There's so much of it. Again, I just had a flash of this scene early in season 2 where you've got Batman, Nightwing, Tim, and Barbara all together, and you get Superman and Superboy, and you get Wonder Woman and Wonder Girl, and you get Lagan and Aquaman. Oh my God, it's like a freaking geeky dream come true watching this fight. It's unbelievable. And the same thing at the end of season 1 where you get Superboy and Superman and Batman and Robin fighting each other. It's just like, it could have been handled so badly, and it was so good. It was perfect. It could not have been more perfect.
Yep. We also need to bring up the Artemis and Wally dynamic here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We've brought this up many times. It's not a secret by this point that their relationship is developing.
Mm-hmm.
It continues to be one of those things where everyone knows it but them.
And we see it again in some of the later episodes, a couple of the episodes coming up too. You see Artemis and Wally speaking to each other differently. There's an episode later on where Wally is worried about his parents and Artemis is concerned. She's like, "Did you call home?" And he's like, "Yeah, they didn't answer and I don't want to go see another empty house." It's just a really tender friendship moment that we haven't seen with them. And I think this really obviously marks that kind of change in their attitude and dynamic with each other. And
one last thing I wanted to bring up here in Crashing the Mode, one of the guns that I believe Mannheim is using, that big chest shoulder cannon one.
Yeah.
It shoots out these little discs.
Yeah.
And the discs have that little 3-circle triangle pattern on it.
The classic Kirby tech.
Isn't that also the classic Brainiac symbol?
Oh, that it is. Absolutely. Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's true. He definitely has that triple thing going on. That's true. It's very Kirby-esque, and the designs and the lightning bolts and the weird boxes, and it's all very Kirby-ish, but you're right. It actually is. And that's true. We haven't gotten a Brainiac. Wow, I didn't even think about that. Like classic Superman villain. We haven't seen a Brainiac yet, and he is a galaxy-spanning villain, so...
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it makes sense that we have not seen him because the focus is not on Superman. The focus is on the team.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure he'll come in if it makes sense that he comes in.
Yeah. He is notably absent when we are talking about larger galaxy-spanning threats.
Yeah. I mean, we see some other Superman villains in season 2, like Toyman.
Right.
But who cares about Toyman except...
No one cares about Toyman.
Except within the context of that one episode.
Right. And I don't think there would be any real precedent that Brainiac and Darkseid would be working together in any relationship.
Well, yeah, I normally would agree with you, but I also would not have thought Raish and Lex would be working together in the same relationship. We talked about that too. I trust that if they figured something out, it would probably be pretty awesome, but we'd figure that out. We have to see.
Yeah, so who knows? Maybe that is something we will figure out later on in season 3, or hey, you know what? At this point, we don't know the time frame of season 3. Maybe there's going to be some more filler. Maybe there's going to be some more comics.
Maybe there'll be a time jump. I don't know if there'll be a time jumper. They can't do 5 years every time because that's just... It's going to be hard to reconcile Batman even still being in the series if they do another couple 5-year jumps.
Yeah.
I mean, it may take place pretty closely. Here's the thing, like at the end of the season 2 finale, Aqualad is giving everybody missions, including tracking down connections and that kind of stuff, which was, again, very reminiscent of the Bereft episode, the episode before that, where Batman's giving them the mission for Bereft, but we don't realize that until after we go back and watch it again. Yeah. So he gives out like 3 missions, and we may just see what those missions were and dive right in, which would be fine with me too. I like the 5-year jump. It allowed some really cool storytelling things to happen, but...
And I think knowing that season 2 ends with Darkseid being brought back into things, I don't see Darkseid as, hey, 5 years later, I'm going to come and mess around. I see Darkseid as taking action.
Yeah, I agree. I think they're ready to move things forward for the Lights plan. So interesting. All right, man.
Interesting. All right. Well, we will consider this mode thoroughly crashed, and Rich and I will no longer speak about these tangents that we've been doing. Let's move on to some fan service. Rich, what have you got for us?
This week, I continue on my previous themes of superhero-themed or DC superhero-themed music. So we've talked about the Ballad of Barry Allen from Jim's Big Ego. We've talked about Ring Capacity from Kirby Crackle. And this week I want to talk about a great song called Wonder by the Double Clicks. If you are not familiar with the Double Clicks, you really need to go check out the Double Clicks. They are a fantastic geeky duet who have done some incredible poignant songs like Lasers and Feelings, Imposter, which is... I can't even just go listen to Imposter and then figure out what it's about because it's amazing. But this one is called Wonder, and not surprisingly, it's actually about Wonder Woman. But the Wonder Woman is never used in the title or in the song at all. It's just like Kirby Crackle and like with Jim's Big Ego, they dive a little deeper in who the character is and the world in which she is coming into. We'll have the link to the YouTube video, but like with all the audio stuff, man, go buy it. Go buy it. Check out the other stuff these bands do. They're fantastic.
That link is in the show notes for this episode. It is also on our website, crashingthemode.com. There's a lot of other resources over there too, links to what we've talked about, fan art, all kinds of goodies. If you create fan art or create any sort of projects about Young Justice or the DC Universe in general, please get a hold of us. We could maybe feature you here in our fan service section or bring you on as a guest to chit-chat with Rich about something cool. Please get a hold of us via email, social media, or on the website itself. And I think it is pretty much time to wrap up this mission and head out of the cave. As always, thank you so much for spending an hour with us today. We really appreciate your time. We appreciate your listenership, and we appreciate any reviews and 5-star ratings over on iTunes or the various other podcatchers out there. Thanks again, and feel the Aster.
Yep, remember everybody, hashtag keep binging YJ, hashtag YJ3 if you are posting about Young Justice, and stay whelmed, everybody.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our computer is voiced by Madison Ray. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.